The topic is really about democratization. Now, democratization, of course, we mean transition to democracy, but that also includes, whether you have transitioned to a stable, consolidated democracy or to unstable democracy, where there can be reversals of democracy. So these are key issues that are being studied. So there are various theories on this, both formal and informal, and there are also empirical studies trying to analyze the determinants of democratization. Of course, first things first, the real important first contribution to this literature was by Lipset's modernization theory that is still today considered by many a cornerstone of theories of democratization. I don't, I'll say something about Lipset later on, but one thing I want to emphasize is that the role of culture in democratization has largely been absent in social sciences. With the exception of Engelhardt and Weitzel, I'll say something about that later on. By culture, I really mean here the set of values and beliefs that people have about how the world works, and I'll be a bit more specific about that later on. And I think introducing the issue of culture and democratization is key in this 21st century that we're facing. And they're really important questions. Will China democratize? That's a very, very important question, given the size of China, given the importance of China in the international order. Will the 20th century trends towards democratization continue that we've seen certainly in the second half of the 20th century? How to think of recent trends towards autocracy, is not autarky, autocracy in Russia, Turkey, Central Europe. And I would claim that an answer to these questions cannot ignore the role of culture on political institutions. So the focus of this presentation is going to be on one particular dimension of culture, which is the difference between individualist culture and collectivist culture. This is not random. So this is, for those of you who know the work of Avner Greif, this is something that some economists have been working on for quite a long time. But it turns out that there's an important field in social sciences, which is cross-cultural psychology, and cross-cultural psychology has identified the individualism, collectivism dimension as the main cultural dimension in the world. So there's a big textbook by Heine, 2008, and my co-author Gorodnichenko, with whom I'm co-authoring this work on culture, we have actually a survey of that psychological literature from which I think economists can learn quite a lot. So I'm not going to give a whole lecture about these differences, but just so that you have an idea, the individualist culture places the individual at the center, has a strong focus on the value of individual rights, freedom, opportunity, individual success. And so behind it is the idea that the individual is not malleable, has innate traits that are unique, and that the individual should basically be thriving in terms of using those traits and enjoying as much freedom and rights as possible. So this should not be seen as a narrow sense of individualism as some being selfish. This is more a view of the world, where people see themselves as citizens, that they have rights and responsibilities. It's really a view of the world, which you can say, broadly, is a little bit the Western view of the world, Western liberal view of the world. The collectivist culture, on the other hand, sees the individuals as embedded in a community. So they're not free-floating individuals. They're part of a community, a tribe, a clan. And collectivist culture emphasizes conformity, adaptation, and harmony. So those are the most important values. The individual is deemed to be malleable and can be made to adjust with enough effort. So they're quite, these are important differences, and there's a lot of research, looking at particular aspects of those differences. So what we're doing with my colleague Gornichenko and me, we're building a model of a possible transition from autocracy to democracy in a polity that is characterized by a mix of individualist and collectivist culture in the population. So the model is very stylized, and I'll just present, I'm not going to go into the technical details, just present the assumptions and the results. But it's a model of endogenous collective action, where collective action, that is the possibility of revolting against an autocratic regime, or possibly a coup against democracy. These can be seen as endogenous decisions. And there is also endogenous cultural change. So there are many things happening, and for those of you who write models, you know that it's always a challenge to deal with these things. So in an earlier version of this work that we wrote down 2012, 2013, culture was exogenously given. And in general, this is more the take that I have, that culture doesn't change very, very fast. But the culture does change, and so in the paper I'm going to present you, this is the first time I'm presenting this, we do allow for intergenerational cultural transmission in the spirit of Bézine-Verdier. And so it's quite a big change to our earlier version of this paper. So very quickly, the main results that we're going to get out of the model is that democratization will always eventually be achieved. Now, eventually, as t goes to infinity, it will be achieved if there's a high enough share of people with individualist culture in the population. There's also the result that if there's a higher share of people with collectivist culture, this can lead to a stable, a good autocracy. Good under quotes, because as you probably know, they're very, very different autocracies, and I'll be a bit more specific by what I mean about good autocracy. But you can think of China, for example, as an example, good autocracy, and Zimbabwe as some bad autocracy. I'll be a bit more clear a bit later. Reversal of democracy can be more likely if there's a higher share of collectivists in the population. And then when we look at cultural change, endogenous cultural change will tend to consolidate individualism under democracy and collectivism under a good autocracy. So the predictions, in a way, are that you may see two kind of stable regimes, democracy and good or efficient autocracy, and they might stabilize over time. So then we present some empirical evidence looking at the effect of individualism scores on average polity scores. So polity scores are a way of measuring democracy, but also the quality of democracy over time. We also look at the length of democracy, and then we look at the impact of culture, taking into account, all the variables that have been used in the democratization literature, like conflict, religion, income, education, fractionalization, inequality, etc., etc. So we find that taking all that into account, there is a separate direct effect of culture on democracy. So that's as much as we can say. But, limitation of this study, it's difficult to disentangle this direct effect from any indirect effect of culture via income, because culture also influences income. And so there's a difficulty, what's the direct effect on democracy, and what is the indirect effect via the effect of income per capita, and we're not able to really quite disentangle those. Anyway, so just to look at this broadly, as I said, the traditional view since Lipset is that economic modernization leads to democratization. So this is a very optimistic view of the world. As countries get richer, then they will become democratic. There's a variant of this, which is now more or less the accepted wisdom by Przeworski et al., saying that, well, it's a bit more complicated, that this correlation between income and democracy is explained more by the absence of regime reversal in richer countries. There's a whole literature on this. As I mentioned, Przeworski et al. There's some papers by Acemoglu and co-authors showing that that the relation between income and democracy is present mostly in the cross-section, but it's not present in the panel. That has been disputed by some people. Now there's some research kind of showing that there is a link from income to democracy in the very long run, but you have to go back at least in the 19th century. So one can go back to 1963. There's actually a book by Almond and Verba emphasizing the role of civic culture on democracy. And so this is something that's not very well known, but in a way you can find that there is actually a link between Almond and Verba and the more well-known work of Putnam on Italy, which is about the strength of civil society and the quality of democracy. Then there is some recent work by Engelhardt and Weitzel showing that modernization actually leads to cultural change, and so this is a little bit more, I wouldn't say in the Marxist tradition, but in the tradition looking at the effect of economic situation on values, and so that's something important. Let me mention there's a work by Tiki, Verdier, and Vindigny, and Tiki is actually here in the room today, and later work by Besley and Person, where they look at the role of political culture in the stabilization of democracy, and I think in terms of recent papers, these are really among the first to look at this. So what we do is that we mostly focus on the role of culture, on the choice of political institutions, but we do also look at the feedback effect on the effect of institutions and expected institutional change on cultural change. Let me explain the model first. So assume that you have a polity of two classes. Sorry, it's not infinitely lived citizens, so that's a mistake. Two classes, rich and poor. Size of the population is normalized to 1. The poor are in the majority, so it's a proportion delta, and the rich are in proportion 1 minus delta. It turns out that for most of the analysis, it's only the poor that are going to matter because they're going to make decisions about autocracy, but the rich at some point may make decisions when it comes to reversal of democracy. So you have the income of the rich, YR, the income of the poor, YP, and these incomes are related to average income Y by a factor theta, which is an indicator of income inequality. So you see that YR is equal to theta times the average income divided by the share of the rich. And same thing for the poor, except it's 1 minus theta. So that's an indicator of inequality that is going to play a minor role, but still is going to play a role at some point. So we have an initial situation that is that of autocracy. There is a good autocrat, and the good autocrat, we're going to assume, is not going to tax or redistribute. So the good autocrat, you can think of, it's an economic world where basically nobody gets taxed, there's no redistribution, nothing happens. So it's a pure laissez-faire. Some people may like it, but of course, it's also a regime where people don't have political rights, even though that's going to play some role at some point. Then the bad autocrat, it's a bit of a caricature here also, the bad autocrat steals all income from citizens, and so people just get everything, rich and poor, all their income is stolen under a bad autocrat. Then if you have a successful transition to democracy, there's going to be redistribution from the rich to the poor, and the tax rate is going to be the preferred tax rate of the poor and the majority, so some kind of median voter model is going to be true. And so there's going to be an optimal tax rate tau p, which is going to basically give redistribution tau y minus yp, because yp is smaller than y, so there's going to be positive redistribution to the poor, and this positive redistribution is going to have limits because there's a distortionary cost of distributive taxation, C of tau times y. All this is very, very standard. Now, you have two cultural types in society at time t, the individualists who are present with share q it, and the collectivists who are present with share q ct. And then we just assume that these are the only two types in society, but that really doesn't matter for the results. You could have, anything else, but just to simplify. Now, we do make an assumption that individualists derive a positive utility, phi, from living in democracy, that they get some positive utility from freedom, from the rights that they have under democracy. And the collectivists derive, by symmetry, the same utility phi from living under a good autocracy, because in a good autocracy, basically there's going to be harmony and stability, things that collectivists may value. Now, phi can, in principle, be arbitrarily small. It's, the only reason it's really going to matter in this model is when we look at cultural change, when parents decide what culture they want to transmit to their children, their own, or then some other culture. Do they want, a switch in the culture? So, the timing. A new generation is born in the beginning of period T. They inherit culture from their parents, so they don't decide, the parents decide for them. And then the shares of individualists and collectivists evolve depending on the existing shares in society on one hand, and also on the expected utility of having one or the other culture, and I'll explain that a little bit more in detail below. After having inherited their culture from their parents, this new generation decides or not to attempt a revolution. So, if they want to do it, majority has to go for it, and the outcome will then be determined one period later. And then, once that outcome has been determined, they transmit their culture to their offspring, and then, it goes to the next generation. So pretty short-lived individuals. And one thing that's going to matter is to what extent people are, altruistic in the long run or only in the short run. So we assume the probability of successful collective action is parameter P. But the probability of ending up in democracy or autocracy is going to depend on the share of individualists versus collectivists in society. So there's this assumption that there's some kind of positive association between the political regime and culture. So when people revolt, if there's going to be more collectivists in society, then they're more likely to end up with another kind of autocracy. But if there's more individualists, they're more likely to end up with democracy. And this is probabilistic. This is probabilistic. Think, for example, of the Arab Spring. When the Arab Spring happened, people didn't know exactly what would be the outcome of the Arab Spring. There were differences in the outcome in Tunisia, in Egypt. And so there's the idea that you have these deep cultural parameters that affect somehow the influence, but in a probabilistic way. So if they're more individualists, then after a revolution, they're more likely to have democracy. If they're more collectivist, they're more likely to have an autocracy. When an autocracy happens, then it can be a good autocracy with probability alpha and a bad autocracy with probability 1 minus alpha. So again, you have these two different types of autocracy. So First, let me give you the version with non-altruistic parents. That is, they just decide on collective action, and then they look at what happens as long as they live, but then that's it. So when deciding on collective action, they care only about the expected outcome in T+1. So first thing to note is that there's always going to be revolt against a bad autocracy, because that's the worst possible outcome. People will always want to revolt. It doesn't mean the revolt will be successful, but they will always want to revolt. So whether you decide to revolt or not is going to be something important. Now, next. So you're going to have thresholds, Q lower bar I and Q lower bar C. So this is a threshold for QIT, and the threshold Q lower bar I is lower than Q lower bar C, such that if the share of individualists in society is above those thresholds, then the poor will want to revolt against a good autocrat. Okay? But if it's below that, they will prefer not to revolt against a good autocrat. And the difference between those thresholds goes to 0 as phi goes towards 0. But the most important thing to remember here is that depending on the share of individuals, it's not, it will affect the probability of democracy, but it's also the decision or not to revolt is going to depend on whether the share of individuals is above a certain threshold when you have a good autocracy. Cultural change. Now, cultural change, we have a law of motion a la Boyd Richardson or Bézine-Verdier, but the more altruistic parent type, I'll give you a bit later, is more a la Bézine-Verdier. Here it's a bit simplistic. So the idea is that the share of individualists at period T+1 is going to be a function of the share of individualists at period T. It's also going to depend on the value that people get at T+1 if they have individualist culture versus a collectivist culture. And this is going to depend, this value function is going to depend on the state in which they are, which can be democracy, D, good autocracy, G, or bad autocracy, B, and on the decision they take to revolt, R, or not to revolt, and R. Okay, so it's somewhat forward-looking, but people don't live that long, and so they only look at their own horizon, and so altruism is very limited here. So what are the results that we get? We find that individualism will always progress under democracy. The idea being that once you have democracy, then you want to give individualism to your children, that they will benefit more from it. On the other hand, collectivism will progress more when you have stable autocracy, that is a situation where you have a good autocrat and people don't want to revolt. And then you have a little bit more a little bit more complicated situation when you have, starting point is bad autocracy compared to good autocracy. And so we find that individualism will progress if it's above a certain threshold. And and then you have a threshold when you have a starting point a bad autocracy or a starting point a good autocracy. The threshold for a bad autocracy is actually not as high as under a good autocracy. And if it's above those thresholds, then again you will have a progressive individualism. Otherwise, you will have individualism going back. Anyway, one result that you get out of this, which is kind of paradoxical, is that if you have a long enough period of bad autocracy where people want to revolt but they are not able to do it, then it could happen actually that the share of individualism is going to increase, and that could be favorable to democratization later on, because if the share of individualists is higher once you have democracy, it has some effects. And so essentially, you have two absorbing states when you have a low initial share of individualists. You can have either a good autocracy and you get stuck with a good autocracy, or you can end up also with democracy, because I say this is probabilistic. On the other hand, if you have a high enough share of individualists, that will lead to democracy and to a spread of individualism, and democracy will be the only absorbing state. That is, that when you have a good autocracy, people will always want to revolt, and then, in the end, it will always succeed one way or another. Now, one question, what happens if a reversal of democracy is possible? So, assume that the rich may try to bribe the collectivist poor in order to support a reversal of democracy, and we assume that can be enough, because the collectivist poor somehow benefit less, they feel less comfortable under democracy. They don't have this FI, but they do, they kind of like what they have when they have a good autocracy. And so the result we get here is that democracy reversal, where the rich can bribe the collectivist poor, can take place at time t if the share of individualists is below a certain threshold, and that threshold is actually going to be lower as inequality is higher. And so the idea is that if the share of individualists is very high, then you could try to bribe people, but if you bribe them for a reversal, there's going to be a high chance that people will return to democracy later on. So if there's a high chance you will return to democracy later on, then that creates a smaller surplus for bribing the poor. On the other hand, a higher inequality and redistribution requires higher bribes. So if you have high inequality, the poor, even the collectivists, they enjoy a very high level of redistribution, and so to bribe them, to undo democracy is going to be more expensive. Okay, now let me go to the model with altruistic parents. Here basically people are looking at each generation and taking into account the interests of future generations in a very altruistic way. So people are much more forward-looking in this version of the model, and also when transmitting cultural values to the offspring. This part of the model is much more complex. I'm not going to give you the value functions, but they're clearly much more intricate. But we do have some results. So first of all, similar to the simple model, we do have thresholds of the share individualists, such that if it's higher than that threshold, then people will choose to revolt. So VIGRT higher than VIG, and GR means you revolt under good autocracy, and so there's a higher value of revolting under good autocracy compared to not revolting under good autocracy, both for individualists I and collectivists C. And this threshold exists, for all values of P. Independently of the probability of success, these thresholds exist. And there's a corollary of this, that as long as you reach that threshold, and as long as alpha is strictly positive, then democracy will be introduced with probability 1 as t goes to infinity. So in the end, democracy will be introduced. Cultural change, we have some results here. Once democracy has been reached, then again, the share of individuals will increase over time. Similarly, under a good autocrat, the share of collectivists will increase over time. So you have this kind of divergence, cultural divergence under a democracy and a good autocracy. Under a bad autocrat, you're going to have thresholds. Thresholds depending on whether if you land under a good autocracy, there's going to be a revolt or not. That's Bn. And then you also have thresholds depending on whether you're going to revolt once you land up with a good autocracy. And again, once you're above those thresholds, then you're going to have increase in the share of individuals, or you're going to go below. And so here also we see that endogenous cultural change stabilizes both democracy and good autocracies. A corollary that we get out of this is that while parents may optimally choose the culture they transmit to their children, the cultural shift may make everybody worse off. And so one could show that actually an increase in the share of collectivists in society, even though it's rational from the point of view of parents, is going to decrease the value functions, but it's going to decrease all value functions. Okay, so it makes society as a whole worse off. Reversal of democracy. Here we're still working on it, so I'm presenting a result that's a little bit different. It's with an exogenous probability of reversal. So if you have an exogenous probability of reversal, I'm not going to give you the value functions in detail. Then if this probability of reversal is high enough, then you can show that there will never be a revolt under a good autocrat. Okay, because if you have a good autocrat, you're not going to have redistribution, but the value of democracy is going to be much lower, because the value of democracy is going to be lowered by the probability that once you have democracy, it will be undone, and that's going to be favorable for a good autocracy. However, if you're below this threshold kappa, then all the previous results are going to hold. Okay, so let me now go a little bit to the empirical part of the analysis. So for the democracy scores, we use the Polity 4 index, and we take an average over 30 years. So that covers roughly the third wave of democratization. We'll also use the length of democracy, that is the fraction of years with continuous positive polity scores. For the cultural variable, we're going to use what we have used always so far, that is Hofstadter's measure of individualism and collectivism, which is based on surveys among IBM employees across the world initially, but that was generalized to 76 countries later on, and now actually I think 93 countries. So it's based on factor analysis of survey questions, and so people are asked, lots of questions, and so this score loads positively on valuing individual freedom, opportunity, achievement, advancement, recognition, and loads negatively on valuing harmony, cooperation, good relations with superiors. So this is kind of in line with the literature on individualism and collectivism, with the values that are behind them. And so you have to think of those scores as kind of rankings. And so those rankings have been validated by other studies on smaller sample. So here you have, just a map of individualism in the world. So dark red, brown, etc. are the more individualistic, as you can guess. And then the greener, especially dark green, are the more individualist, collectivist. So as you see, the more collectivist countries are mostly in Asia, but also in Latin America, in the Andes region especially, in descendants of the Incas, so to say. But you also have some collectivism in Africa, like in Nigeria, Ghana, and then you have variation on every continent. So now one question we may have here is that the link from political regime, from culture to political regime, can go both ways. So culture may affect the choice of political institutions, but the length of democracy may also affect values and social capital. And so the first paper to kind of look at the latter aspect was Persson and Tabellini, 2009. So finding a good instrumental variable satisfying the exclusion restriction in a cross-country setup can always be problematic, and there's always some counter-arguments. People will always come up with some counter-arguments. Nevertheless, should we kind of abandon this kind of research? I don't think so. So I'm still going to present what is a best attempt to look at this. So we're going to use as instrument a variable that is the historical pathogen prevalence. So historical pathogen prevalence was the prevalence of pathogens, more than 100 years ago. So in the, going back in the 19th century, so before the epidemiological revolution, so as long as we can go back. And so there are studies, in particular by Fincher et al., show that there's a direct link between pathogen prevalence and collectivism. So the idea here is that a higher pathogen prevalence pushed communities to adopt more collectivist values, emphasizing tradition, putting stronger limits on individual behavior, showing less openness towards foreigners. And you could see this in a kind of evolutionary way, that is that those communities that adopted those values probably were better at survival in that context than those that did not. So it's not a functionalist adaptation. Think of it more as an evolutionary adaptation. So this gives you a map of the pathogen prevalence. So a higher pathogen prevalence is things that you have in red. So it's mostly across the tropics, as you can see. So it's not quite there's some correlation with collectivism, but still you have to see it. And here, this is a map of the polity score as we use it. So I'm not going to dwell on it. It's pretty well known. So coming back to the historical pathogen prevalence, the argument for exclusion restriction is that there's actually no link from pathogen prevalence to democracy or autocracy. Autocracy is not necessarily better than democracy at dealing with pathogens, so it's very difficult to make that case. We use a second instrumental variable, which is the Euclidean distance between the frequency of blood types A and B in a country, relative to the USA, but it could be relative to the UK, whatever, that's not the most important. That's something that we've used in our previous work, and that we see as a proxy for cultural transmission. That is, people who have, who are genetically similar are also culturally more similar, because cultural values as much as genes get transmitted, but it's not a theory of genes. It's a theory of proxy for cultural transmission. So here again, there's no arguable link from blood type to democracy. These are data that are widely available, can be cross-checked, but contrary to our historical pathogen prevalence, they could be an instrument for another cultural variable, for example, like trust. So what we can do is we can use those two instrumental variables and do some statistical testing of exclusion restriction, especially because the latter variable can be more easily contested. So let me give you the tables. So we're a bit late, but just I just want to present the results rather quickly. So here in this first table, you have OLS and IV regression. So for the IV, we use either the pathogens or the blood distance and the pathogens, and we have the over-identification test, the p-value, when we use the two instruments. So if you regress the polity score on individualism, you see that it's positive, it's robust across the different specifications. In this table, we also add variables related to conflict. Conflict can have a negative effect on democracy. And so the variables here are low risk of cross-border conflict, low risk of civil disorder, ethnic tensions, or war. And so when we introduce them, some of them are significant, not all, but the coefficient on individualism remains quite strong. So the IV is in general, the IV coefficient is in general a bit higher than the OLS, which tends to show that there could be a measurement error. So if you take the coefficient column 3 as a benchmark, which is 0.199, a 1 standard deviation increase in individualism, say from Iran to Finland or Argentina to Switzerland, should lead to a 4-point increase in the average polity score. So the polity score, as you probably know, goes from -10 to +10, so an increase in +4 is not insignificant. When we include the conflict variable, it actually increases the size of the coefficient. So we have the results remain robust when we add controls for other cultural dimensions. So here we have other variables of culture by Hofstede, power distance, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation. Most of them are actually not robust, except for uncertainty avoidance. And trust, actually we put trust. Trust is not robust. The share of Muslim population is significantly negative, significantly negatively associated with the polity score, but the individualism score remains robustly significant when we include those. So now one thing that's a little bit more delicate, in modernization theory, income is seen as the main determinant of democracy. So you say, well, what happens if you regress polity score on individualism and on income per capita? Now that's problematic because we have other work that's actually coming out, that came out this year in the Review of Economic Statistics, where we look at the effect of individualism on income per capita, and we find that it's very strong and goes through innovation. So if we just put income per capita here, from the econometric point of view, it can be problematic. We can have collinearity, endogeneity, so it is problematic. However, even when we put it, we do see that individualism is still significant. And so we have some regressions where we take individualism, we have log income per worker. It's by the way, also always significant. We also use variables that have been used in literature, like institutions, protection against expropriation risk, natural resource rents. That's has also been seen as a negatively associated democracy, and inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. So whatever we do, so panel A is OLS, panel B uses the 1 IV, panel C uses the 2 IVs, individualism still remains robustly significant when we put this in. We also use other variables like ethnic fractionalization, cultural fractionalization, ethno-linguistic fractionalization. They're actually not really significant. The education index is actually significant, and that's in line with the modernization theory, but education is also strongly related to income per capita. Now, ideally, we would like to perform some panel data analysis. Unfortunately, cultural data only exists in cross-section. It's very difficult to have cultural data in the long run. That's what we want. Even if we could have it over 20 years, it's not going to help us very much. So one way out of this is to look at long difference regression. And so looking at effects of individualism on changes in the polity score over 40 years. So here we look at polity score in 2000 relative to 1960, regressed on individualism, regressed on log income per capita between 2000 and 1960, difference with education, and the initial polity score in 1960. And we do find a robust effect when we do this. So finally, not finally, in this table, instead of looking at polity, we look at the fraction of years with democracy. Again, with some of the variables that I've been looking at, the results are very, very similar. So the difference is that if we look at polity, it gives us an idea of the quality of democracy, but here the fraction of years with democracy is a more direct measure of what we're having in the model. So finally, I just want to show you one table that has a prediction that is in line with a specific aspect of the model. Indeed, in our model, it predicts that if you have a higher share of collectivists, there will be a higher probability of transition from a bad to a good autocracy instead of democracy relative to individualistic countries. Now, it's very difficult to measure what is a bad autocracy, what is a good autocracy, but what we can do is that we can study transition data, transition from autocracy to autocracy, or from autocracy to democracy, and vice versa. And so here, this is the last table I want to show you. So we look here in particular at the probability of transition from autocracy to autocracy, and we see that it's negatively associated with individualism, which is in line with the idea that under collectivist culture, you will have a higher probability of a transition from autocracy to autocracy. So, to conclude, we presented you a model of individualism and democratization where a higher share of individualistic culture is more likely to achieve transition to democracy over time. Collectivist culture can stay stuck with a benevolent autocracy, and the empirical analysis suggests that there can be a causal effect of individualist culture on polity scores. So what can we conclude out of this? So one conclusion is that is not necessarily optimistic, is that it can shed some doubt that collectivist cultures, even as they become economically successful, will automatically end up adopting democracy. And so that's true about China, Vietnam, Singapore. And so in those countries, democratization may take a very, very long time. So that's one of the lessons. It's not necessarily what we may want to hear, but actually, it's a proposition that may influence how the world would look like in the future. It does lead to moderate long-run optimism about democratization in the Middle East. In spite of their very authoritarian history, their individualism, collectivism scores are kind of in the middle. It's a bit like Russia. And so, but they have a higher individualism score than many Asian countries. Now, of course, we should not draw, any deterministic conclusions from this. Now, let me finish by saying, what about Hungary? I'm sure some people might ask, what about Hungary? Well, it turns out Hungary has a very high individualist score, higher than Poland, Ukraine, Russia, actually probably the highest in the whole region. So how to interpret this? Well, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that it's a measurement error. It can happen. Another possibility, it's not a measurement error. If it's not a measurement error, there are actually two possibilities. One is that it's just an outlier, and as you know, when we present regressions, and actually it's not so much an outlier because the polity score for Hungary over the long run has been quite high. So even in this analysis, it's not really an outlier. But maybe it's not an outlier. So if it's not an outlier, then there are two possibilities. One possibility is that the theory I presented to you, has deep flaws, and we're for open research, as we know. The only real truths are about things that have been refuted. We know this from Popper, and that's something that George Soros cares a lot about. But the other possibility is that despite everything that's happening in Hungary, we may have reason to be optimistic because the current culture and the population, if it's what these scores say, give reasons for us to be optimistic about democracy in Hungary. Thank you very much.